Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. For much of the modern era, the United States has stood at the heart of the global economy, anchoring the international monetary system, shaping the rules of trade, and driving global growth through its innovation and financial power. But today, this long-standing leadership is being tested on multiple fronts. In this episode, we explore the shifting foundations of U.S. economic dominance, from pressures on the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency to the rise of China and the growing assertiveness of other economic actors. We look at how geopolitical fragmentation, internal U.S. political tensions, and debates over industrial policy are reshaping America's global position. My guest today is Cédric Tille, Professor of International Economics here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He is also head of the Bilateral Assistance and Capacity Building for Central Banks program and is a faculty associate at the Institute's Center for Finance and Development. Welcome back, Cédric. My first question for you is, for decades, the United States has been seen as the central engine of the global economy. What are the main factors that historically anchored this leadership, and which of those foundations are now being challenged?
So the dominant role of the US in the world order has started after the First World War, but really came in full after the Second World War. The US was clearly one of the main actors of the winning side. But also European powers, such as the UK, had a big cost of the conflict, which the US didn't.
Right.
So it was in this dominant position. What is quite interesting is historically, when a country is dominant, it tends to use this in a relation of force. The US was smart enough to actually build a rule-based international order. So it was referred to as a benevolent hegemon. No, let's not be naive, benevolence had its limit.
Right.
There was also power plays at first, many emerging countries realized that. But still, the US built first the GATT, which is now the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank. So it played a dominant role there, but was still treating other countries as a partner, and therefore as a big element of soft power that went alongside the hard power, which was there still. So now turning to the challenge to these foundations, well, first of all, there's the economic size. The US is still a big economy, but the rest of the world, in particular emerging market, and notably China, have grown bigger. And this has been happening for years. So there is a need to rebalance, and that's been a long-standing question in the governance of multilateral institutions. A case that is often discussed is the IMF, where the voting rate of the US, but I would say even more of Europe, are overrepresented. And so this is a question going forward, because if you stay to this asymmetric representation, the other country would say, well, you know what, we're going to build our own institution. So here's this risk. That's not just with the current US administration. It's beyond the US and it's beyond Trump. The second challenge for this is predictability and rule of law. You can have a dominant role when people say, okay, you know what you're doing, you have a reasonable understanding, were you willing to engage? Our interests may not be aligned, but at least we know what you're after. If you get in a situation where things are unpredictable, you're not going to play such a central role. It will take time, but your position is going to weaken.
And how secure is the US dollar's position as the world's leading reserve and transaction currency? Are we seeing meaningful moves toward a de-dollarization, or are these shifts overstated?
So I think these shifts are overstated. There is some movement, but for the role of a currency, the currency in question, or the countries, the policies behind it, don't have to be good. You just have to be less bad than the other guy. So when people say we're going to leave the dollar, it's like, yes, and to go where? Right. What anchors the role of a currency? First, size. You need a big economy. You need big liquid markets. The US has this. Another aspect is institution. So you need predictability, rule of law. That is now in question, seriously, in the US. But then the other countries, where China, in terms of rule of law, it's questionable. Europe has it, clearly, but Europe is still quite fragmented. There is no one European bond. I mean, there is some that they've built since COVID, but it remains fairly small. So Europe still have to reach a capital market integration. Right. So all the other alternatives have this limit. Now, we have seen some move out of the dollar for foreign exchange reserves, but this move is relatively limited. It is slow. And what is interesting is central banks have not moved massively into the euro. We may think they have moved into the renminbi, not so much. In fact, they have diversified in a range of other advanced currency. This can be Nordic countries. You also have the currency of Australia, New Zealand, very little Swiss franc, interestingly, simply because the Swiss bond market, especially the sovereign bond market, is minuscule. Some shift into gold. So what is interesting in this shift is it goes to relatively small currencies, and there is a limit on how much you can do that because these small countries don't have big market. So what is interesting with the dollar is the rest of the world is less satisfied with it than it was, but it's kind of stuck with it.
And you mentioned China. So to what extent is US economic power being reshaped by global geopolitical trends, particularly the rise of China, renewed industry policy in Europe, and fragmentation in global trade?
So I think the US, I would say, in economic policy has nothing to fear except itself. So when we see what could weaken the US role is inefficient policies in the US. Let me take an example, green energy, green technologies. China has a lead very clearly. I mean, in terms of solar, in terms of green, they still use a lot of CO2, but we see a big rise in solar and wind energy. Europe also, not to the same extent. The US was in that game, but has basically quit it. Right. They decided not to shut down many projects. So the US may actually have made a choice, quite wrongly, to miss the next technological revolution. And maybe I shouldn't say the next because it's already ongoing. So the US has taken itself out of the game with a fairly strange fascination for fossil fuels by the government. The states, it's a different story. So the US may actually have seriously weakened its own position, but they did that to themselves.
Right.
So there are other trends, but they had all the means to resist these trends, and they decided not to.
That's very interesting. And how do internal US dynamics, such as political polarization, which is the case right now, rising debt, and debates about industrial policy, affect the country's ability to sustain its global economic leadership?
So the main challenge I see for me is unpredictability. What you had in the US was always a system of check and balances. This is, the Constitution is built this way. What we see now, the courts, yes, some courts are checking. The Supreme Court, not always. Congress seems essentially to have gone on vacation. So there's no counterweight. For instance, tariffs, the ability of the president legally to impose tariff is quite limited to very specific cases. In fact, this is now in front of the Supreme Court. You would have thought that Congress would step up to the plate and say, hold on, we have a role to play. None of that. And so the institutions are only as solid as the willingness of people participating in them to uphold them. Okay. And this is seriously in question in the US. So it's this lack of predictability. We have a player where we could always foresee. So yes, they play in favor of their interest, fair. But you always have the sense of how they were thinking, what they were after, and suddenly you realize that it's becoming quite random. So there's no predictability, no reliability. And then there's also the weakening of alliances, being tough on their own allies, with the wrong impression that they've been taken for a ride. So this unpredictability, this impression that the adults are not in charge anymore, is what's weakening. And we mentioned the dollar. A particular aspect that is important is independence of the central bank. There's a reason why we have central banks independent, with a job to focus on low inflation, to be protected from political pressure. We see clearly in the US that this is put into question.
Is the US losing influence in major economic governance institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO? And if so, what does it mean for international economic coordination?
So they are losing influence by choice. So there's several summits, for instance, the recent COP summit in Berlin, but they just decided not to go. There are also an attitude of telling other countries, don't reach agreement that we don't agree to, even though we're not there. Okay. So there is still quite a presence at the, for instance, let's take the case of the IMF, there's a big player, clearly. But now we're going gradually in a situation where countries say, well, how could we function without them? Or keeping them on the sideline? It's not something you do easily. Other countries have also to take their responsibility. Take an example. Here we know in international Geneva is a very severe situation because the US pulled out funding. But what I always find very surprising is how cost effective the UN is. It doesn't cost much money to run. So other countries could step up and replace the US, which so far we don't see. So the countries need also to put their money where their mouth is, as the saying goes. And if they do so, it is possible. Now, how fast with the US stepping out, but not keen to be replaced. So there's going to be a lot of fairly chaotic move there. But their influence is not what it used to be. And sadly, it's because they chose it that way.
And are we moving toward a multipolar economic order, or will the US remain the indispensable economic actor for the foreseeable future? And what scenarios seem most plausible over the next decade?
That's the big question. What we see is already some fragmentation. For instance, in international investment by multinationals, there is some evidence of a US Western bloc and a China bloc on the other side. These things take a lot of time to happen. So there is a possibility of fragmentation. Now, in many financial markets, the US remains dominant. So for instance, we talked about foreign exchange reserve. It's not that easy, if you want big reserves, not to hold so many dollars. In trade, we could have there more of a segmentation because most of the trade, world trade, does not involve the US. The presence of the US in trade is way smaller than in financial market. So we could have a situation where trade split, trade flows such as rare earths that are not substitutable away from remain. From financial markets, there could be a possibility of a China bloc, a Europe/US bloc. Now, Europe, would it be an equal partner? Would it be more dominated? That all remains to be seen. So the only thing we know right now is that we don't really know what it's going to look like, which is already in itself very discomforting because in financial market don't like unpredictability. The question also, what if we get a big financial crisis in the US? Far from a theoretical story. What we're seeing now in the administration is a will to deregulate financial market. Just rewind, after 2008, we realized that the regulation had been too weak, so there was a push to regulate markets again.
Right.
The US is going the other way. My call is within 10 years, we see 2008 again. I hope I'm wrong.
Right.
But this could happen. Now, if this happens, then if the US is not able to rein in their finance, what kind of environment do we see? Do the Europeans say they're too dangerous, so we have to build our own market? But then the Europeans have to build, not just talk about it. So often, I wonder always to which extent Europe truly exists in the terms of implementing this decision and delegating power. All of these are open questions. Interesting time, shall we say, even though sometimes interesting, we wish it wasn't.
That was my last question, but I wouldn't mind. Can I ask you just an additional question based on something you said that I thought was very interesting before about how the US chose to step away from kind of the green economy and focusing more on fossil fuels? Do you think that is a long-term trend for them, or is that just short-sighted vision for the time being, given who's in power right now?
I like to think the second, but I'm not so sure. So there's clearly the administration now, to put bluntly, real people drill, and that's it. Okay, or the people who just do solar, this is kind of a joke. Well, it's clearly not the case anymore. I mean, the renewable energy are cost competitive for many of them. So there is clearly this view. What is striking, sometimes you feel that administration think of this more than the energy sector itself. Many fossil companies realize that they diversify. No, part of this is greenwashing, but not only. So sometimes they are more royalist que le roi, so to speak. Well, there is a big segment in the Republican Party that is aligned like that. So for me, I think this is more deeply rooted than just the current administration. Whether the rest would constitute a majority looking forward, hard to tell. But it's not a fluke, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, right.
Yeah.
Well, Cédric, thank you very much for taking part in this episode of What Matters Today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.